So when did your mind flip when you were teaching education at a public school? Because we haven't got to there yet.
Right. My mind flipped almost the first year in my classroom seeing this educational coma.
Yeah.
And I later came to understand that if you go to a public school in an affluent area, things aren't very perceptible as they are in a very poor area. So I worked in a very poor area for about 20 years. And I think that the poverty of the families and the students really highlighted the defects in the theory of the education.
Really? How so?
Well, it was just, it's obvious in the affluent schools. I went to nice schools when we were middle class and went to nice public schools, and it just doesn't appear as if much damage is being done. But at the end of the day, in the schools I worked at, it was apparent that apathy and boredom and this coma, they were just almost automatic. And you have kids in public schools kind of active in things. Parents have them in after-school things that are with the home and with the family, whereas some of the poor areas where both parents work and they're already at a poverty level, the TV's the babysitter, the kids are listless. It's really a drastic difference between the two. And I always thought for me that highlighted the theoretical poverty of the ideas in the public schools, where you wouldn't see that in an affluent area.
Right.
Because sometimes you say people get educated in spite of going through a bad program. And then we see where we work that they end up terribly uneducated.
Interesting.
Terribly. It's an insult to the human person.
Wow.
Where I worked.
So at what point did you start to realize that and want to move away from it?
Well, I started right away, and I started moving away from it right away when I discovered the fairy tales and the Greek myths. I taught 6th grade, and I watched those little stories turn them on and wake them up.
You were a secular humanist at the time.
Yeah, I'm still a secular humanist.
And what led you to start looking into the fairy tales and teaching them to your students?
Fortunately, fairy tales and myths were a part of the curriculum in 6th grade, and when they put them into textbooks, they twist them around and make them hideous, but I got my hands on a couple copies that weren't twisted around, and I watched it bring my students to life.
Really?
I saw that, and every year I did more and more and more of that. And
what kind of fairy tales are we talking about? Like
we're talking
Father
Grimm's fairy tales, yes, and Hans Christian Andersen. The good fairy tales. The modern fairy tales are twisted around and really of very little value.
Would you be someone to recommend Grimm's fairy tales?
Yeah,
my kids love it.
I read them still to this day. Yes, I'd recommend them. Yeah. And I remember when I first encountered them, they were very off-putting.
They're so bizarre.
They're so bizarre and
it's like someone's on LSD and it's like, I'm going to write a story.
Oh, it's just a bunch of mean people doing mean things, and according to the secular humanist, very off-putting. And I still remark back how off-putting it was to me. And then as I kept reading, then you begin to see the appeal and the truth behind it. And these are stories written by a people, not by a person. And in them are deep wisdom. There's deep wisdom and character building things. And now I'm able to take a class and get them into the fairy tales very quickly.
Wow, that's wonderful.
And they just love them. It brings them to life.
So how did you go from the fairy tales, Greek mythology, to becoming a Catholic?
Right. Well, those things led me to the Greek poets, right? Homer, Iliad and the Odyssey, and then the Greek philosophers, to Plato and then to Aristotle. And then I ran into a mentor. I started becoming interested in learning, so I went to the teaching company. And that's I think that's somewhat of a secular venture. They take the best professors in America and have them teach you a subject. And I ran across this guy, Louis Marcos. And he taught this course on literary criticism from Plato to the present age. And I loved it. And he also did a little class on C.S. Lewis. And the way he is so expressive, he's a faithful Baptist Christian. The way he expressed himself was just so beautiful, except for his Christianity. That really bugged me. It was just, really, really bugged me. I loved what he was saying. I learned so much about the ancients up to the present from him. And C.S. Lewis, he made me fall in love with C.S. Lewis.
How can you not?
Yeah, but his Christianity really bugged me. So I actually emailed him. I said, hey, I love your enthusiasm. You're a great speaker. But what's with the Christianity? Don't you know? And I told him, didn't you realize that's like medieval? And he was so kind. He got back to me. He wrote to me. We became friends. We started to meet up.
Wow.
He took me under his wing, this Baptist. He introduced me to Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict the 16th, and he introduced me to Thomas Aquinas, to St. Augustine, to all the great medievals. He had me read these things. He basically took me to the Tiber River. Wow. Did all but shove me in.
And he's a Baptist.
And he's a Baptist. And I couldn't figure this out, but I finally, the last place I wanted to go was the Catholic Church. I was pretty much rabidly anti-Catholic.
Were you?
I was. I met a lady who taught the RCIA at a church, and we were looking for a church for our kids the way my parents had a church for us.
Yeah.
So they can have a choice.
Yeah.
And ran this beautiful lady who's running the RCIA, and she says, "Oh, you're looking for a church? You should come to St. Philip's." And I said, "Is that a Catholic church?" She said, "Yes, it is." I said, "It'll be a cold day in hell when I set foot in a Catholic church."
Yeah.
I said that,
Yeah.
and sadly, I meant it. And then there must have been some kind of cold front or something in hell,
In
because
hell, and you ended up there.
a year later, I went to a mass, and I was just horrified that I really loved it.
Now, was
the
it
first
a
mass?
beautifully celebrated mass, or was it one of these
It
ugly
was not
ones?
beautiful at all.
And
It was
yet
beautiful
you
to
were
me.
moved.
Yes. Oh, I was moved. Preceding that, though, we had our oldest daughter, Kenya. She was in the public schools, and my wife wanted to put her in the Catholic schools as a kindergartner. But I was so anti-Catholic, I said, "No, we can't do that. We can't expose her to those medieval people." So we took her and put her in public schools, and in 7th grade, she was going to go into 7th grade, and we went to the orientation. And we know the public schools, and I had been shifting away from them for the last decade,
You're
right?
still teaching at this
I'm
time.
still teaching,
Yeah.
yes. And our kids are not at our school. They're at a nicer school. But we went to the 7th grade orientation, and it was just so horrendous. We just said, "Okay, we're moving them to Catholic schools." And we moved them to Catholic schools, and I was okay with them being Catholic.
Yeah.
But when I went to that mass a year later, I was taken in.
Wow.
And at that point, it was another 2 years of RCIA. And by the time I did I was welcomed into the church, it was hook, line, and sinker, heart on fire for Christ.
Wow.
I was in it.
Amazing.
It's a miracle of grace.
And then how did you get out of public schools and start teaching Catholic?
Well, I stayed in the public schools, and there became a bigger divide. I started to get in a little bit of trouble because we were reading the fairy tales and novels and great things, and they caught on to it and actually banned the novel, said I couldn't read it. So we would have our myths.
Which novel were you reading that got banned?
Oh, we were reading C.S. Lewis novels.
Wow.
You know, we were. You know what? I introduced him to the
Like
Odyssey and the Iliad, and
Okay.
yeah, things like that. Narnia. Oh yeah, the Narnia series. of
That
course.
was you. They banned you from teaching that.
Novels in general, because they knew I was up
What?
to something. Oh yeah.
You were banned from
I was banned.
teaching novels.
They said no more novels for you, right? And so the class took to putting a mythology book, the textbook under the mythology book. If someone came in, we'd switch books.
No.
Yes, I probably shouldn't have said that in public.
That's
but
awesome. You should totally
Yeah,
have said that.
that's what we did, and we did that for years, and it became increasingly clear that
That's wonderful.
I wasn't teaching the Catholic faith, but I was teaching truth, and that became more and more problematic. And my last year in the public schools, I had attracted some attention from some students in another class, and they asked me questions. I gave them a philosophical answer, and I got in pretty big trouble for it.
What were the questions, can I ask?
They were questions about marriage,
Yep.
and I didn't give them the Catholic answer. I gave them the ethos, logos, pathos answer. Just consider it from these three
Explain
types
that
of
to
arguments.
us.
Ethos, logos, and pathos. These are the three kinds of arguments you can make. You can make an appeal to the emotions, which is pathos. You can make an appeal to reason, which is logos. Or you can make an appeal to ethics, which is ethos. And if you consider the question about marriage from those three angles, at least you will have considered it fully. And that's as far as I went.
Yeah.
It turns out the little girl had relatives that were deeply offended, and I got in a little bit of trouble for that. And I wrote up the trouble I had, and it just turns out my mentor knew another guy who's kind of a hero of mine, Dr. Anthony Esselin.
Yep. Hero of
And-
mine too.
Yeah, hero. And I sent the essay because my mentor, who knows him, introduced me to him, sent him my essay, and he said, you should send that in and have it published. And I sent it to Crisis Magazine, and it got published under a pseudonym.
Yeah.
Because and then from there, that's why I started writing.
Yo, thanks for watching. You can watch the entire episode on YouTube if you want. You can listen to it at The Matt Fradd Show by subscribing on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And feel free to support me, patreon.com/MattFradd.